I'm Alexia Murphy, 31, standing at the back of a downtown conference auditorium while the lights dim and my screens wake. The room is tiered, glass walls catching the city at dusk, a rented stage and a moderator lectern glowing under a single bulb. Bottled water beads in cool rings on side tables, the HVAC hums like a distant engine. Evan, my brother, shuffles note cards at the lectern. Dad folds his arms in the front row. Daniel Reed, my COO, taps his watch by the side curtain. Sarah Klein, my general counsel, thumbs a document folder. Grant Lewis, the former banker, studies the screen in the second row. Naomi Ellis, a reporter, steadies her camera near the aisle. Two process servers stand at the exits and Liam Hart, the AV director, sits in the booth like a pilot. On my quiet cue, Evan's slide deck blinks and the presentation behind him flips to transfer documents bearing my LLC's name. The murmurs rise. I lift the mic and say, "We'll proceed in my order," while security closes the doors and the recording light blinks red. Before I tell you how I engineered this moment and why the people who called me too stupid now answer to me, tell me where you're listening from. Comment your city. I read everything. Subscribe and switch on notifications for more true family revenge stories like this. The hotel was my childhood home in the way some people's houses are just places and others are entire maps. The lobby was my second living room, marble I could trace with my fingertip, a pattern of veins I knew better than my math homework. The bell desk was where I did flashcards under a banker's lamp, tucking homework into the ledger between arrivals. Weekends were not about sleepovers, they were about polishing brass with housekeeping until my fingers smelled like lemon cleaner, memorizing guests by the scent of their perfume and which pillow they liked fluffed. When other kids learned to ride bikes, I learned banquet layouts. I could walk the ballroom blindfolded and place a stage, a run of tables, a dance floor, and a service station based on memory. Busy nights smelled citrus clean and printer toner, a scent that meant money and noise and bright lights. Mom taped checklists behind guestroom doors and left margin notes on napkin folding protocols. Dad barked from his office across the atrium when bills ran late or a vendor slipped. My job, unofficial and constant, was to make the friction disappear, unnoticeable, polished, seamless. Staff started calling me Little Manager long before anyone put a title on my door. I had a walkie clipped to my waistband the way other kids had stuffed animals. The hotel taught me how to turn chaos into order and how to do it so people thought it was effortless. Mom's standards were less a set of rules and more a compass grafted to my ribs. She said, "We don't serve rooms. We serve people," and I wrote that line in a notebook and underlined it until the ink bled. Her system lived on index cards, greeting scripts with exact phrasing, the 2-minute table visit timing, the 3-step complaint recovery that always ended with a human apology, not a voucher. The night she got sick, I took vendor calls from the stairwell because it made her feel like the world would still be steady while she slept. I learned her cadence. Calm voice, specific promises, follow through. When she died, I kept her clipboard with the edges frayed and pages replaced. I copied her handwriting on memos when I had to because people responded to the shape of her thought. Staff came to me not because I told them to, but because I kept her spirit alive in small contact sheets and in the way I noticed a housekeeper's limp before anyone else did. Dad came to me when he wanted it profitable. He knew I could close a budget gap without a press release. I balanced both worlds, the financial ledger and the tenderness Mom folded into service, and I thought that balance was love. It never felt like sacrifice, it felt like fidelity. Invisible work became my value long before anyone on a board noticed the line items I owned. I would spot spoilage on banquet cost reports in the margins, small waste that ate into gross operating profit, and fix it before morning. Evan would miscount plates for an event and get the handshake on stage. I would have been the one to reconcile the inventory at 2 a.m. without applause. I wrote standard operating procedures for everyone from night audit to concierge, updated the website copy so returning guests felt remembered, trained the dishwashers on timing so the dinner plates arrived warm. And for years I wasn't on payroll for most of it. Dad called me a natural hostess as if skill were some soft trait you either had or didn't. That language meant my work had been downgraded to charm. The board labeled me great with people, a compliment that neatly erased the spreadsheets and vendor schedules behind my name. I learned to solve problems before being asked and to accept the thank yous given to someone else. Quiet competence became my armor. I leaned into it. Teach a new server the choreography of a banquet, rewrite a flawed sales packet at midnight, patch the reservation system when it hiccuped on a holiday weekend. None of it read like capital to them, it read like the background hum keeping their main event on stage. So I cataloged my labor in a private ledger: dates, hours, outcomes, because if no one would recognize it, I would own the record. Dad's patriarchy was not a single speech. It was a pattern of small delegations stacked into an architecture of authority. He ran meetings with men at the table and women in the room. His rule, spoken and unspoken, was that men presented while women prepared. Evan's internships were glossy and brief, studded with business cards and hotel badges. Mine were 12-hour shifts threaded with lessons nobody credited me for. At family dinners, Dad would ask Evan about strategy, then ask me about napkin folds. I brought data to meetings: revenue per available room, cost per occupied room, projected occupancy, and their response was to trade jokes about feelings and to pat my hand like a houseplant needing watering. At one point, after I had covered 2 departments solo with the flu, Dad told me, "You don't have the shoulders for pressure." It landed like an X-ray. The bones were wrong, not the spirit. Evan learned how to perform competence. A cultivated grin, a rehearsed pause, a line about vision. I learned to perform invisibility. I kept making things work and they kept applauding the visible performer. The pattern became a slow burn. The more I made myself useful without a title, the more the house's authority ossified around the men who took the bow. There was the rebranding plaque we paid for after Mom's memorial, my design, her phrase engraved, and my name wasn't on it. The sign looked right, caught the light the way she'd have liked, but the credits were carefully chosen names in black on brushed metal. I still polished that plaque at odd hours because it belonged to her, and in the staff room I would catch a housekeeper smoothing the edge and whispering her thanks. That quiet gratitude kept hurting in the same place. I was being treated like a steward, not an owner of ideas. I started to catalog these moments as data. Each slight was a line in a ledger I kept in my head. Who interrupted, who praised performatively, who took credit, and when the room applauded the visible face of effort I had provided. It wasn't just humiliation, it was a pattern that mapped power. I didn't lash out. I learned to absorb, to act, and to log. That log would matter later. I stayed because the hotel was not only a building, it was Mom in plaster and brass. When she died, the property felt like a living memorial, a place where her voice lived on in checklists taped inside walk-in closets and in the way the housekeepers folded corners. Leaving felt like tearing a page out of her book. I told myself stewardship meant staying. I told myself I was protecting a legacy, not resisting a promotion. Loyalty pulled me back like gravity. Maria in housekeeping was more than an ally. She had kept my loneliness at bay during long nights on the desk, bringing me a thermos of coffee and the kind of small kindness that feels like family. There was a ledger of favors and debts that had nothing to do with money: a front desk clerk who once covered my shift when I was sick, a banquet captain who would call me when a wedding hit a snag. These people made it impossible to walk away in one gesture. I owed them continuity. I also stayed because I believed competence would eventually buy authority. I thought if I accumulated enough wins, better metrics, smoother events, happier staff, someone would notice and change the narrative. Recruiters called with generous offers. I politely declined. I convinced myself I was waiting for Dad to make the right chair move, to recognize what had always been under his nose. The gala invitation felt like the horizon I'd been waiting for, a public scene where Mom's standards could finally be acknowledged. I dressed for it as if it were the culmination of years of uncredited labor. Instead, it became the moment they erased me. The seeds of independence were planted quietly, almost humbly, in the small, stubborn actions I told no one about. I took night classes in hospitality finance at a community college, sitting among grad students and mid-career managers, learning how asset management and loan covenants fit into the picture. I never told Dad. He would have laughed at the practicality of balance sheets for soft skills. I saved every spare dollar I could, opened an account under a name that would later become Alethea, and watched the balance climb like a slow, satisfying meter. I met Daniel at a turnaround panel where he spoke about closing distressed deals without the noise. He had a way of making spreadsheets look like blueprints, and I took his business card and emailed him raw notes. We met for coffee that smelled like burnt espresso and agreement. He joined my plan as COO because he believed my eye for operations matched his appetite for deals. Sarah, whom I met at a mediation for a supplier dispute, answered a cold email and became the counsel who could turn theory into agreements. She taught me about layered limited liability companies and chain of title, how the legal wording could protect strategy without theatrics. I began a spreadsheet called If I Had a Hotel and filled it with vendors, covenant dates, and likely breach windows. It was dry, practical intelligence. I also started a daily ritual. One small action toward leverage before 9 a.m., a phone call, a note, a freelance research order. I took evening runs and let my head sort through numbers instead of resentments. I didn't plan theatrics then, I built a spine. The quiet accumulation of knowledge and small cash reserves felt like muscle training. It was not revenge, it was preparation. The gala loomed with signals I ignored because I did not want to see them as weapons until they were unavoidable. The invitation called it 45th anniversary, a new era, and the subject line felt like a headline I might have written for press. The seating chart, when it arrived, placed me at a far table near the exit while Evan was centered next to Dad on the dais. Little things, board packets arrived with my operations report accidentally omitted. HR asked for a legacy photo of Mom for a slideshow and never asked if I wanted to speak. The PR firm sent a draft bio that called me a long-time supporter instead of listing my responsibilities. Evan asked me to proof his slides with a smile that assumed I'd be grateful for backstage access. He wanted polish, not interrogation. I ironed my dress anyway and rehearsed a short, clear speech in my head like a test run. Each signal felt almost small enough to dismiss, like a colleague's offhand remark you correct in passing. But there were too many tiny cuts. Evan asked for my labor metrics to round out his narrative and sent a draft with figures slightly inflating the occupancy rate. Dad, in a memo I was not copied on, introduced Evan as acting CEO without so much as a footnote about my operational role. A PR email arrived calling me a supporting cast member in the anniversary materials. Irene, a longtime minority shareholder, texted, "Are you okay? This feels off." I typed back a short, steady reply, "Thanks, watch it." In the final week, backstage politics intensified like a storm gathering on the horizon. Evan dropped by my office under the polite pretense of checking facts, but his questions skimmed where he wanted applause. He asked for last year's banquet yield and then made a casual comment about how he'd frame it. We tripled engagement. When I asked about his plan for capital reserves, he dodged with a half-joke. Dad announced in a staff email that Evan was acting CEO for the gala. I was not copied. A PR draft landed in my inbox that renamed my role as longtime supporter. I imagined the bio pasted into a printed program where my name would be visible but my contribution invisible. Irene texted again, "Dinner Friday, we need to talk." I wanted to go, but business stacked up and I told her I'd call. When I asked Dad directly what my role would be, he said without looking up from his notes, "Be gracious." His voice was soft like a dismissal wrapped in affection. That night I packed a cardboard box with personal items from my office. A coffee mug with Mom's handwriting copied in Sharpie, a small framed schedule she used to tape to the back of a pantry door, a folder of my own annotated sops. I drove them to my car and left a few photographs on the desk for the staff. It felt like moving out a life one box at a time. I learned to catalog the hits. Evan would tell a story about a guest's glowing review and tuck my operational fixes into the anecdote, and someone would give him a standing ovation. Dad praised his charisma and patted my hand the way you reward a child who fetches slippers. A PR rep edited my bio to support language and sent it out, apologizing later for a proofreading error. That apology was perfunctory. The damage was the language. I began to treat every small dismissal as data, who minimized, who redirected credit, who used sexed compliments as insults. Those microaggressions taught me restraint. They taught me where the weakness in the house's frame was, the assumption that charm was leadership and that the people who make things happen could be ornamental. I didn't explode. I counted, I recorded, I mapped the permissions those men had been given. When knives are thin, they're easiest to fold into pockets. I folded mine until they fit into a plan. The night before the gala had a smell. Dust, fondant, and polished wood with a nervous tang of citrus cleaner in the air. Evan FaceTimed me from the ballroom at midnight, camera panning like a man showing off a trophy room. He waved his hand toward the podium where a custom CEO plaque lay face down, the letters glinting in the ambient light. "Which angle is more flattering?" he asked, the kind of casual that hides permission. He laughed, and the laugh landed like a warning. I sat on my kitchen counter and watched the video, the screen's blue light washing my face. I took a screenshot of the plaque and sent it to Daniel with one word, "Noted." My stomach tightened. I printed my resume at a 24-hour copy shop because the act of printing felt like climbing a ladder you hadn't planned to use. Maria texted me a photo of the staff room with the anniversary programs stacked untouched, and a note. "They asked us to wear our uniforms, we'll be proud." Her pride made my throat tight. I took the dress out of the bag, ran my hands over the fabric, and hung it on the back of a door like a pinned hope. I slept fitfully, a sleep full of stage lights and the echo of laughter. I rehearsed nothing out loud. Instead, I wrote a list, small, precise things to remember: bring program, keep composure, collect program card, go home if it's a show. My list steadied me more than any pep talk. In the morning, I would show up ready because I wanted to see how large their erasure could be before I decided what to do with it. The gala was staged like a play with a single lead. The family brand. The script had been written so long ago that 100 small pages of privilege breathed through it. Dad opened with a speech that read like a history lesson, dates, images, the founding story told in reverent tones. He spoke of hard work and family values with a hand on Evan's shoulder and no footnote for the woman who'd kept the house running. People leaned forward as if the narrative were a hymn. The pianist filled the pauses with light chords and servers moved through rows like rehearsed extras. When I stood at the edge of the stage to straighten a centerpiece, a PR rep took my elbow and guided me away from the camera's frame. "You'll be behind the curtain tonight," she said, soft as velvet. I smiled and stepped back because the staff looked to me for cues. If I made a scene, they might be asked to choose sides. I kept my voice small and my hands visible, like a manager offering calm. The program printed my name in small type as longtime supporter. I had written the operational plan that reduced turnover by double digits that year. Someone else got a plaque. Dad's voice became sharper as he introduced Evan. "Leadership demands courage," he said, and his hand rested possessively on Evan's collar. The room exhaled as if they'd been holding their breath. Cameras focused. The servers in the back paused with trays mid-step. There was a weight to the moment, a shared hunger in the room for a tidy story where the visible man took the reins and the invisible labor smiled. I felt that weight, and with it, the knowledge that my erasure was intentional, not accidental. The exact phrase hit like a center cut. Dad said into the microphone, with the hotel's chandeliers catching the slight tremor in his voice, "You're too stupid to run the hotel." It wasn't a private slight. It was a public stripping, worded like a diagnosis. Evan leaned into the mic and added, "Men are better leaders," as if he were delivering a punchline he'd practiced for weeks. Laughter spilled around the room like a rising tide, too quick, too eager. Someone whistled. Silverware chimed in the applause as if to punctuate a verdict. For a second my body went quiet, the corners of the room blurred into a single color. I felt the program card between my fingers, paper thinning from pressure. I did not stand and argue, I did not reach for the microphone or call out the lie. Instead, I set my glass down without making a sound, pushed my chair back on the floor that had known me since I was small, and left. The exit felt like a wound closing over a shape. In the parking lot, under sodium lamps and the late heavy air, I texted Daniel 3 words. "I'm ready now." It was not a threat, it was a start. The room that afternoon was a catalog of witnesses, each face a ledger entry that would matter later. Board members sat like a jury in tailored suits, their hands folded or fanning a program as if deciding on a verdict. The chamber president occupied the front with a ribboned lapel, eyes trained on any manufactured drama. Vendors clustered near the back, measuring where favors might be won. Reporters leaned near the bar with phones in hand, sipping coffee like they were drinking evidence. Guests who had been coming for years sat primed to applaud the story the family told itself at every anniversary. Housekeeping stood quietly near a service door, uniforms starched, eyes watching for the moment their work would be noticed. Evan's college friends, the ones who knew how to hold a phone for the perfect angle, lined a side pew. The pianist played softly at a grand to provide emotional punctuation. The chandeliers lit faces that looked away from mine or looked right through me, their light caught on jewelry and collars and betrayal. Naomi stood by the aisle, press badge visible, notebook open and pen poised. I thought about how she might frame the scene. I noticed Grant from the bank, his expression careful, and Mark Rivera from supplies answering a quiet text. Each witness mattered because the thing they witnessed would become the currency we would later trade. The number of eyes in that room was not accident, it was leverage waiting for the right hands. My name was spoken like an explanation of absence. The implication that whatever I did was not capacity but decoration. The words were clinical, surgical, even precise enough to cut through the warmth of memory and leave a cold, public wound. When Dad said stupid, it wasn't about a mistake. It was a verdict on competence, offered in the kind of voice that brooks no reconsideration. The echo of that moment followed me afterward. In the press it would read like family banter, in the staff room like an order to realign loyalty. The sting wasn't only in the insult itself but in the way the room received it, hungry for confirmation, ready to laugh and forget. I did not rise to the bait. People expected a scene, an argument, a collapse, a pleading handshake. Instead, I contained it. I listened as if I were taking notes for a report. I watched Naomi Ellis's pen slow, watched Grant's jaw set, watched Maria's hands fold in her lap. The words were a wound I catalogued. Speaker, audience reaction, timing, tone, the little noises that make private humiliation a public asset. In that room full of witnesses, those noises would become evidentiary. I did not cry out and I did not beg. I did not chastise Dad or call Evan a liar. I didn't try to outshout the laughter or to make the room uncomfortable with truth. I could have stood in the center of that ballroom and demanded recognition, but what would that have done? It would have been a theatrical plea that played to the moment instead of to consequence. I had learned early that drama feeds gossip. Paperwork forces action. Instead, I collected. I took the program card that listed the evening's toasts and tucked it into my clutch like evidence. I made a mental list of every face that laughed and every face that did not. I watched the cameras, noting the angle and the brightness because footage preserves what memory will want to revise. I nodded to Maria in the back with a tiny, steady gesture and mouthed, "It will be okay." The calm was not forgiveness. It was preparation. When they expected a storm, I delivered a ledger. Outside, the notes of the band faded into the parking lot's echo. I sat in my car and let the night air take the betrayal from hot to usable. My heartbeat slowed from a wild drum to a metronome that could be followed. I called Daniel and left a voicemail that was short and precise. "Meet at 7, we start." I opened my notes and recorded a voice memo detailing the speech, the exact phrasing, the laughter, the timing, time-stamped, raw, immediate. I printed copies of the gala program in my glove compartment and photographed the podium plaque Evan had shown off in his video the night before. I set a calendar event titled 2 years. The act of scheduling made the pain less like a wound and more like an instruction. I drove to Lee's apartment with my dress hanging from the hook in the backseat. The bag felt heavier than it should, full of a life I'd been carrying in invisible increments. Sleeping on her couch that night with the dress folded on a chair and my phone set on vibrate, I felt strangely light. The exit had been a pivot and the pivot had a direction. I wasn't running from the hotel, I was stepping toward a plan I had been building silently. Alone in the night, I rewrote the small rituals that would become the scaffolding of what came next. The first night as an outsider was punctuated by small domesticities that felt monumental. I ironed the dress on Lee's kitchen counter because smoothing its wrinkles felt like smoothing out urgency. I made a list, simple, stark. Leverage columns labeled debt brand people. I filled rows with names, Grant Lewis under debt, Mark Rivera under vendors, Irene under people. The spreadsheet was crude, but its act felt ceremonial. I cried once, 2 minutes, not a flood, a short, hot recognition of loss, and then I wiped my cheeks and wrote, "Pain is information." That line steadied me as effectively as any spreadsheet. I opened a new checking account under Alethia's name that week. The banking visit was bureaucratic and intimate. A teller asked what the business did, and I told her simply, "We rescue hotels." Her eyebrows lifted and she stamped the form without comment. Small things like opening an account felt like taking the first step out of someone's orbit. I made a folder called Leverage and filled it with notes, vendor invoices, and a printed copy of the gala program. Then I went to see Daniel at a coffee shop at 7 a.m. He arrived with a refillable notebook, a calm face, and no one to charm but me. We talked for hours, practical steps and timelines, not catharsis. Choosing silence was my first strategic rule. I would not scream into the press while I was still building the scaffold underneath me. No public rebuttals, no defensive op-eds, no angry social media threads. I told Dad I needed space and let his silence sit like permission. It would mean he could not accuse me of sabotage later. I stopped answering family group messages unless they were logistics. I continued to show up for staff when needed, but with a different tone, measured, data-driven, and less personal. I logged morale in spreadsheets, not in gossip. Evidence beats rhetoric. I made a daily ritual of one tangible action toward leverage before 9 a.m., a call, a research purchase, a check deposited. Time became my ally. I set a horizon of 2 years to build capital, credibility, and a visible track record. I would underpromise and overdeliver on every outside rescue we attempted so lenders would trust contracts signed under my name. I leaned into discipline, therapy to clear the emotional edge, dawn runs to sort out tactical thinking, and the hard daily work of building relationships with people who could help in the long run. I stopped telling the story to sympathetic ears. Stories make you human, but documents make you powerful. I converted small acts into muscle memory. I learned to let the room have its narrative while I built a parallel one in private. I kept evidence in triplicate and backup. I kept my mouth closed. This silence was not cowardice. It was a strategy that assumed the worst would happen in the room and that the document that followed would be the lever that changed everything. My horizon was 2 years of meticulous patience, and every morning I began it with one small, irreducible action. Our first rescue was small and perfect for our reputation needs. A seaside independent with a toxic cash cycle. Daniel ran the physical improvements while I tightened revenue management. We did what we promised, no hyperbole, and in 90 days we improved gross operating profit by 11 percentage points. That first win bought us the right to be taken seriously by lenders who had seen too many turnaround promises evaporate. We registered a neutral brand presentation that Dad would never connect to my name. The PR consultant I hired placed thought pieces under my byline about stewardship and operations, small, steady credibility. We underpromised and overdelivered so our performance would be a slow, reliable drumbeat rather than a single, noisy burst. Data was the voice I trusted most. I set up alerts and subscribed to industry reports so I could see my old hotel's revenue per available room and average daily rate in real time. I paid for competitor analysis and tracked occupancy trends like a weather report, but numbers aren't just charts, they come from people. I cultivated quiet relationships across the property. Front desk agents who texted me off hours, banquet captains who kept me honest, even inventory clerks who would send a photo of a dubious linen shipment. I listened in union meetings as a respectful observer. No one noticed and respected me for it. I sat beside Grant at a conference as if nothing was at stake and let him talk about covenant language and special servicing. He gave me details because people like to be heard. I mapped every vendor and aging on payables into a color-coded calendar on my wall. The day a supplier's receivable would become a legal concern wasn't a guess, it was a date. I tracked Evan's public comments for contradictions. Every exaggeration was a future witness to a pattern, and I kept copies of every public filing, every press quote. The intelligence network I built was low drama and high discipline. Data in, noise out. I removed emotion from the inputs so my decisions would be arithmetic, not rhetoric. Mapping vulnerabilities felt like drawing a risk chart for a building before an earthquake. Debt covenants were obvious weak points, debt service coverage ratios and capital expenditure reserve requirements that, if missed, triggered events of default. I found that the hotel's senior loan had a narrow cushion for cash flow and that the reserve account had been drawn down twice in the last year. Trademark maintenance was another brittle hinge. The renewal process had been neglected in favor of advertising spend. Vendors, Mark Rivera at food service showed up with a high receivable balance and a willingness to negotiate. Linen services had stretched payment terms thin, and a specialty refrigeration contractor had invoices aging past 90 days. Governance had its cracks too. Minority shareholders like Irene complained privately about opacity and bad faith at board meetings. They'd be willing to sign a proxy under the right conditions. Labor was both a liability and an asset. The union had unresolved grievances but was open to a deal that protected wages and seniority. And finally, the flag. National brands would move fast if guaranteed leadership stability and a clean operational transition. North Star's expansion map lined up geographically with my target. Buying the senior loan felt like buying a key without telling the locksmith which door it would fit. I watched the debt service coverage ratio weaken over 2 quarters. It moved from caution to watch by the bank. I approached a fund that purchases non-performing loans through an LLC that looked like any other distressed asset buyer. Sarah structured the purchase so the beneficial owner would not be disclosed beyond the necessary legal filings. On closing day, I became the lender of record. Grant, who'd been lead banker on the loan, attended as an observer and later told me that the cleanliness of the assignment made his head nod. The paper trail, assignment agreements, transfer notices, endorsements was all recorded, stamped, and backed up in 3 places. I didn't want the hotel to know their lender had changed until the moment the documents would do their work. I prepared cure notices and default affidavits in advance. Those were not theatrics, they were ready instruments. The idea was simple: if the borrower missed the cure window by even a day, the loan holder had the right to take action. I didn't rush to pull any levers. I bought the position and then waited for the covenant math to make the decision for me. The loan was both an option and a pressure point, an ability to step into management when for cause existed. Having the senior loan in my hands meant I held the language that could trigger immediate operational change. Acquiring critical vendor receivables was surgical. Mark Rivera, whose food supplies the hotel depended on, was owed a significant balance. He'd been burned by late payments and unpaid work before and had been contemplating litigation. I offered to buy his receivables at a haircut less than face value but immediate cash for him, and the paperwork transferred the right to collect. We did the same with the linen company and the specialty fridge contractor, offering them cash and a promise of expedited payment under new management. The assignments were drafted with notices prepared but not sent. They were levers waiting unpulled. The point of buying receivables wasn't to be cruel, it was to have the right to insist on cure or action when the moment came. If vendors were suddenly unpaid and a buyer presented demand, operational pressure would mount fast. Receivables made the situation tangible to suppliers and management alike. They created a mesh of obligations that, when combined with loan control and brand ownership, would leave the existing board and CEO with very limited choices. Each purchased invoice was a small, private contract between me and a supplier, evidence of leverage organized into legal language and a timeline. We kept quiet about these buys. The move only mattered when we decided to play all of them at once in a public room where witnesses would watch the dominoes fall. We also grabbed the related domains and social handles the moment they became available. A freelancer who had done design work for the hotel months earlier had copies of old logos and layouts. She emailed them to me after I offered fair pay for her files. That file package, fonts, color codes, a suite of artboards cost less than a single reprint of a banquet menu but gave us the right to the signals the brand sent. Owning the mark meant I could take down their sign in a sentence, and for me, that was always the point. Symbols matter. I commissioned a tasteful refresh that kept Mom's language and softened the edges of the old identity, proof that stewardship could mean adapting with care rather than erasing history. I was careful about optics. We did not announce, we owned. The new IP holding company signed the filings and Sarah logged chain of custody notes so everything could be presented cleanly when the time came. The trademark wasn't a tantrum, it was a lever. When planted in the right room with the right documents, it would be proof that the name was no longer theirs to give away. Securing minority shareholder proxies was a work of patience and small gestures. I had known Irene for years. She came to tea sometimes and always brought a box of cookies shaped like tiny keys. She was tired of board opacity long before I was ready to act. I started by listening the way people who want to be trusted do, without interrupting, without promises. At one meeting, she unloaded quietly about a closed-door vote and a string of late disclosures. I didn't answer with strategy. I answered with a question: what would you like to see change? That question, simple and human, opened a door. Over months, I met other small shareholders in lobbies and breakfast rooms, people who had been promised transparency and given brochures. I listened to their grievances and took notes, names, dates, the tone of meetings where agendas were changed on the fly. Sarah helped draft revocable proxy forms with explicit voting instructions contingent on cause. The language was plain. If the board failed to remedy identified breaches, these proxies would transfer authority to a trustee or designated party. We escrowed the proxies so they would be available immediately when a trigger was met, and Sarah logged chain of custody records to ensure there could be no claim of manipulation. Irene signed with a sigh and a look that felt like relief. She wanted a trust that honored Mom's name and staff, not more family drama. We folded that ask into the proxy language: shares to be transferred to a staff scholarship trust if the board accepted cause-based resignations. The proxies weren't headlines, they were quiet commitments from people who'd had enough of performance theater and wanted governance that actually governed. Negotiating a replacement flag required a different kind of honesty. Maya at North Star knew downtown assets and had a plan for a curated portfolio. She liked buildings with character and management that could deliver on a brand promise. Our conversation began for both of us not with key money but with constraints: labor peace, a credible operations team, and clear governance. North Star wanted to know if the leadership change would be stable or just a spectacle. I told Maya the truth. I wanted to honor standards and invest in staff, and I had a plan that made those things measurable. We built a term sheet that made key money conditional on a verifiable leadership change and labor peace. The clause was precise: funds wired into escrow within 24 hours of management transfer, and a phased branding schedule contingent on meeting milestones. Maya's team proposed brand standards and performance guarantees that Evan could not meet without substantially different numbers and a different management culture. That was fine with me. I wanted a partner who would commit to investment, not to a name on a door. North Star's PR team agreed to frame any change as evolution, not collapse, language that would protect staff reputations and make public transitions smoother. Getting a replacement flag wasn't about ego, it was about ensuring the building had a future that required more than nostalgia. It also created a financial inducement for the family to accept that change was better than chaos. The union accord with Noah was one of the moments where moral clarity and strategy met. I approached him not as an adversary but as someone who represented the people who lived in the building day to day. Noah wanted assurances that a leadership change wouldn't mean layoffs or reduced seniority. He wanted training, investment in maintenance, and a real pathway for staff to access higher wages. I listened. Then I asked for something in return, a public affirmation of labor peace during a transition and a willingness to vouch for the trust we planned to create for Mom's name. We drafted a side letter together. It promised no layoffs for the first 120 days, protection of seniority rights, a commitment to investment in training, and the priority consideration of staff for scholarships from the Lydia Murphy Staff Scholarship Trust. Noah negotiated language that gave the union a role in a joint oversight committee for the first year, a seat at the table rather than a back-row witness. He agreed to avoid any disruptive action during the forum so the change could happen in daylight with protections in place. We rehearsed his remarks for clarity. "This is about standards and respect," he would say. That sentence, blunt and precise, would carry credibility in a room of witnesses. Noah's support wasn't transactional. He had seen pattern after pattern of managerial turnover that left staff vulnerable. When he stood to tell the room the transition had safeguards built in, it would shift the frame away from a family quarrel and toward a personnel-first narrative. That was exactly what I needed. The Lenders Forum blueprint was a choreography of transparency and inevitability. We booked Alethia's auditorium because it let us control light and sightlines while remaining a public room. The invitation list was curated to maximize witnesses, board members, lenders, vendors, union reps, staff, and media. I wanted people who had influence over narratives and who would carry the record of what happened. The AV plan was triple redundant: a primary system, a backup server, and a mirrored drive offsite. Liam, the AV director, built a switch that could flip Evan's deck to our documents at a keystroke. The slide behind him would become the record, not a talking point. Seating was tactical. Dad and Evan were on the front row, center. Grant had a mid-aisle seat. Naomi sat where the cameras would catch her face for reaction shots. Irene and Mark were clearly visible near the speakers. Daniel rehearsed cues with staff: green light at slide 3, servers move at slide 4, and doors locked at minute 2 to preserve the room until the documents were delivered. We prepared process servers with 3 separate service packets: notice of assignment, step-in notice, and termination, so there could be no claim of gradual escalation. Tina, our head of security, briefed de-escalation protocols and a discreet removal plan only if needed. Messaging was clinical, present facts, not fury. The press packet was factual and prepped with timelines, named documents, and copies of registrations and assignments. We rehearsed the 2 lines I would say at the lectern until they sounded like policy statements, not personal testimony. The forum was set to be neither ambush nor whisper. It was a room of witnesses, evidence, and decisions to be made in daylight. Media had to be managed without it looking managed. Naomi got an embargoed backgrounder so she'd understand the legal chain I'd present and would write with context, not clickbait. We set up camera positions to capture reaction shots and document the room without feeling like a trial. Liam built redundant playback so that if one file glitched, the recorded assignments would still roll on another server. We provided a press packet after the presentation with the documents, dates, and contact for follow-ups, transparency as armor. Grant's presence was a quiet validation. He sat in a borrowed suit as if he'd wandered in to judge a chess match. We arranged seating to maximize witnesses who could corroborate what we displayed. Vendors, union reps, and minority shareholders in plain sight. Tina coordinated with the venue's tech crew and with local police liaisons, no arrests planned, just safe containment. The whole operation had the look of a conference the way a well-run surgery has the look of a calm operating room. Lights set, instruments on trays, people in place. The legal triggers and contingencies were written like contracts, clean and unromantic. Sarah had drafted cure notices with exact dates and times, every deadline, every missed payment annotated. The step-in clause in the management agreement was precise about cause: covenant breach plus operational failure plus reputational harm. Those 3 boxes were tickable, and we had the documents to show where each box lined up. We prepared termination letters and signature lines where the board would see their names attached to an exit. There were also foreclosure packets ready to file the same day if they refused the resignation and apology route. We didn't want to use those packets; their existence, signed, was leverage. We listed contingencies. If a board member tried to stall, we had motions drafted to freeze accounts and appoint a receiver. If they tried to litigate, we had counsel ready with declaratory relief requests and rapid service plans. We had a list of personal guarantees linked to certain loans, so the consequence was not only corporate but personal exposure if they chose litigation over resignation. The legal architecture was not a threat. It was a set of consequences the documents had already created through neglect and default. Sarah kept a printed binder on the lectern for me to reference, a stack of paper that made the argument impossible to reduce to gossip. Emotional discipline cost something. I took therapy seriously in the months before because I knew clarity required work, not just willpower. In session, I learned to convert humiliation into data and anger into tasks. I ran at dawn to quiet my nerves and to practice counting, breath in, breath out, a rhythm that translated into the exactness I needed at the forum. I stopped drinking at events where decisions would be made. Alcohol makes stories louder and laws of consequence softer. There was a burned journal I kept, pages of grievances I never reread because the act of writing them was enough to move them from immediate fuel to historical record. I refused invitations that blurred the line between family and forum. Dad left messages I did not respond to. Silence became a policy because every answered message was a leak. I rehearsed 2 sentences until they were a kind of law. One to open and one to close. I would not let rhetoric substitute for evidence. I practiced my voice daily, making it even and measured because fury reads as performance on camera. The cost was also private. Friendships I scheduled less often, dinners I canceled, moments of loneliness that felt like bookkeeping. But discipline is a tax you pay in order to collect a larger dividend later. On the morning of the forum, the choreography of control tightened like a drum. Dad arrived and stopped at the reception desk as if he were still the man who owned not just a building but an idea. I watched him from the mezzanine, stationary and visible, not approaching. Evan walked in carrying a laptop bag the way someone carries a prepared argument. Daniel positioned staff in the aisles. Sarah did a final check of affidavits at the side curtain. Liam gave me 2 thumbs up from the booth. The recording light would blink red on my cue. Grant took his mid-aisle seat. Naomi set up her camera. Irene and Mark were visible near the stage. We had placed signs quietly. Lenders Forum, Operations Review. The title framed the event as business, not family. Doors closed on schedule with a soft click. The sound was deliberate, a little like the closing of an argument. I stood where the cameras would capture both my face and the room's reaction. Daniel tapped his watch and mouthed, "Ready." The auditorium smelled of coffee and paper with a faint floral note from the foyer arrangements. My crew looked calm, professional, no fury, only execution. When Evan began his presentation, I counted beats like cues in a play I'd helped write. He started with a customary thank you and slid into a sequence of numbers. Occupancy, yield, year-over-year growth framed poetically as rescue work. Slide 1 was a picture of the lobby with a glossy caption. Slide 2 highlighted operational improvements, many of which I'd implemented. He spoke quickly and with practiced charm, the kind of performance that fills gaps. I watched the soft inflection he used when he wanted a reaction and counted the length of his pauses. Slide 3, my cue, was when the desk in the booth switched inputs. I felt the first hairs on my arm raise in a way that was not fear but precision. The presentation behind him flipped from his deck to a screen showing a chain of title for the senior loan. Dates, transfer signatures, my LLC named as the holder in clear black type. I watched him read the room and then look at the screen. His face, for a moment, showed the exact calculation I'd predicted: confusion, then a search for script. I took the handheld mic with an evenness I had practiced until it lost emotion. "Correction," I said, voice flat. "Agenda change." The beat I'd waited for opened like a trapdoor. The servers at the exit stepped forward at the signal, moving in a choreography that was measured but unmistakable. People turned, whispers rose. I counted the beats of reaction: murmur, pause, gaze shift, and filed them like evidence. The forum had started the way I had designed it, not as an ambush but as a public correction, a room of witnesses receiving the record. I watched faces as the documents unfurled. Evan's smile thinned. Dad looked like a man trying to find the page in a book he thought he'd authored. Grant leaned forward and tapped a pen, eyes confirming what the screen said. Naomi's camera pointed like a small, patient eye. Everything was annotated. Received stamps, timestamps, and chain of custody notes Sarah had insisted on. We'd layered evidence so the room couldn't say later, "Oh, we didn't know." The documents weren't accusations, they were records. The slide tray closed with a soft click and the room hummed with a new atmosphere: less speculation, more accounting. I felt the weight of that shift like a physical thing, a pressure you could measure in breaths. When the process servers moved, everyone could see the motion and interpret it however they preferred. They stepped with briefcases containing papers, hand-delivered notices, crisp and official. One approached Dad, handed a packet, and opened it as if presenting a bill. Another reached Evan and set a document on his lap. Sarah's voice read the legal basis out loud, simple, paced, unemotional, so there was no chance anyone could later claim they didn't hear the facts. She explained step-in rights in plain terms: missed covenants, documented default, and the management contract's step-in clause triggered for cause. I invoked it publicly, saying the words I had practiced until they were mechanical. Management is suspended, effective immediately. Security moved closer, not as a threat but as a presence that made the moment orderly. Cameras rolled and the on-screen caption changed to "Notice served." I told the room the brand's intellectual property belonged to our IP holding company now and that any use was unauthorized. The main display flashed a single line: "Murphy Grand, authorization revoked." The crowd registered the phrase in varying degrees of comprehension. Some gasped, some sat in stunned silence, some fumbled for phones. I stood still and let the room process the certainty of paperwork, stamps, signatures, and dates that create realities. The act of service had transformed rumor into enforceable change. I set 2 folders on the lectern like a dealer lays cards. Option A had a blue cover. Inside were a resignation template, a public apology draft acknowledging gender bias, and a deed transferring shares to the Lydia Murphy Staff Scholarship Trust. It included a non-compete clause for a limited time and language about a private, staff-only farewell ceremony: no press, no hero shots, just closure for employees. Option B was red. Immediate foreclosure proceedings, litigation, enforcement of personal guarantees where applicable, and an asset freeze motion filed same day. I explained both options plainly. Choose A, sign publicly, hand over shares to the trust, and we begin a peaceful transition that protected staff and honored mom's standards. Choose B, and the legal machinery we'd prepared would move immediately: foreclosure, receivership, and personal exposure for those who'd given guarantees. I set a 10-minute clock on a visible screen and told them the time was theirs. Noah stood, and when he spoke, his voice was measured. This is about standards and respect. The staff needs certainty. He explained the union's terms: no layoffs for the first 120 days, priority for training and scholarships, and affirmed he would support the transition if the family chose option A. A recorded message from Maya at North Star played. We commit key money and a reflag upon verifiable leadership change and labor peace. The room heard that money was contingent on more than a name on a sign. The staff watched with something like hope in their eyes. Irene sat forward, her fingers clenched on the program. The choice was not theatrical. It was a ledger left open for their signatures. Realization spread across faces like frost. Dad's first words were small and practical. You can't do this. It sounded less like defiance and more like disbelief in a world reordered by documents. Evan demanded to call a lawyer, his voice strained with a performance he'd relied on for years. Sarah answered calmly, page by page, showing cure notices that had gone unanswered and dates that had expired. Grant, who'd been neutral, nodded at the clarity of the chain of title. Naomi moved closer, capturing the tightness around Dad's mouth for a photo that would carry a headline. Irene met my eyes and nodded once, the kind of tiny motion that can end doubt. The room that had once cheered now watched a family watching the reality of signatures. Dad's shoulders slumped as the legal facts arranged themselves into consequences. Evan tried to rally. There was a moment where he searched for allies in the room and found little more than polite distance. One by one, the practical forces that prop up businesses, lenders, vendors, public reputation, lined up with the documents rather than with his rhetoric. The staff members who had depended on quiet continuity saw a path to protection. After a long minute, Dad's hand trembled over the blue folder and he signed. Evan's pen shook. The countdown stopped at 41 seconds. The seal of that signature was more than ink. It was a transfer of responsibility and credit, and a public admission that the old narrative could not hold under scrutiny. I walked to the lectern with the same measured calm that had guided the room so far. I spoke my 2 sentences as if placing stones in a foundation. This is not vengeance. This is stewardship, I said, voice steady and clear. The words had been practiced until they held no excess emotion, only meaning. I announced that we would rebrand the property under a name that honored standards, not ego, and that the first act of stewardship would be making staff the first beneficiaries of the Lydia Murphy Staff Scholarship Trust. I read the signed apology into the record without inflection so there could be no ambiguity about what had been admitted. I looked at Dad in a way I hadn't when he said those earlier words on a stage. Then he was the man who erases. Now he was a man confronted by the consequences of erasure. He stared at the floor. I closed by repeating something I had said at the beginning because control is clarified by repetition. We will proceed in my order. The cameras caught the moment, and it registered differently than flame and revenge. It was a policy statement, a redirection of stewardship. The family left through a side exit that our security kept orderly. They did not rush or slam doors, they simply exited, and the room acknowledged the end of their control with a quiet that felt like a verdict. I stepped down from the stage not to gloat but to begin work. The lights dimmed, the recording stopped, and the next chapter felt less like a victory parade and more like a responsibility accepted under witness. Grant, in a follow-up, confirmed the loan transfer in a short interview and said what bankers say when something is cleaned up. It's procedural and clear. That phrase quieted a lot of speculation because people trust banks to call a thing if it's done right. Mark Rivera called to say he'd been paid and that he'd like to bid on the future catering contract. His voice had relief in it. The chatter in banking circles framed the transfer as clean, which made litigation less attractive for the family. Evan deleted social posts, then hid his accounts. Dad went quiet in a way that said more than any message he could have written. Silence, I learned, is louder than 100 explanations. We moved fast on staff transition because the people who run a hotel are the ones who keep its heart beating. The first week we held orientation in a small event room. New standard operating procedures that stitched Mom's old checklists into modern protocol, a training schedule that began immediately, and clear reporting lines so no one was left guessing. I stood at the back and watched Maria sign the first scholarship intake sheet for the Lydia Murphy Staff Scholarship Trust. Saying her name out loud and seeing her daughter's picture on the first application made the plan feel less like a headline and more like a promise kept. Noah reported early wins. Grievances that had been open for months were resolved within days and staff retention numbers stabilized. He told me quietly that the union had been cynical about promises before, but that seeing signatures and escrows made a difference. Maya wired key money into escrow as soon as the transfer became public, and project managers booked site surveys. Renovation plans moved from PowerPoint to scaffolding schedules without a single lost booking day. The lobby felt familiar but different, home without imprisonment. People returned to work with a steady look in their eyes, not the hesitant one that comes from hoping things don't get worse. We prioritized safety, then investments, then training, and each commitment was a small contract that staff could point to and say, "This is for us." The family tried the familiar moves of rewriting history, and I expected them. Dad left a long voicemail about private discussions and wanting to meet in person. I archived it, labeled and dated, and didn't answer. Evan sent an email that had the shape of contrition but the content of avoidance, an apology that made no mention of the words he'd said on stage. I saved it. An aunt texted that family should be family and asked why I had to make things public. I replied once with a short message. The documents were public. A cousin's wedding offered a chorus of whispers and polite distances. People tried to place the moment into comfortable categories: misunderstanding, miscommunication, a generational gap, but the documents resisted tidy narratives. They offered alternative stories. That I'd ambushed them, that I'd weaponized paperwork, that I'd been cruel. I let them offer those versions and kept the originals where they belonged, on file. Documents are hard to fold into gentle stories. They sit flat and prove what they prove. I refused to participate in rewriting or to trade memos via family chain messages. Boundaries hardened into a policy. Letters only through counsel for anything substantive, and for personal outreach, a single line of acknowledgement if it came from someone I still trusted. The family's attempts at narrative control eroded quickly when the facts sat on public record, and when staff and lenders began citing the same filings I had. Legal closures moved like careful machinery. Shares were transferred into the Lydia Murphy Staff Scholarship Trust with the Secretary of State filings completed and the trust's bylaws uploaded to public registries. We filed the management step-in with the appropriate regulators and submitted the notice of management suspension as required. The franchise agreement with North Star signed into effect once key money hit escrow. Their team began the compliance audits and brand migration plans. Vendor assignments were addressed. We paid Mark with interest as part of the receivable purchase agreements, and the linen company signed a new payment schedule that included priority returns for any disputed items. The trademark enforcement letters went out at dawn, and a crew took down the old signage in the smallest, cleanest way possible. No drama, just a ladder, a truck, and a permit. Someone filmed it and we posted a short statement. Stewardship requires accurate marks. We kept foreclosure packets in archives, prepared, notarized, and shelved, because the existence of those documents was leverage rather than a bludgeon. Sarah's final memos summarized exposure and closure, all transfers recorded, vendor claims reconciled, regulatory filings complete. Those memos sat in 3 places. My counsel's office, our secure cloud, and a printed binder in my desk. It felt good to watch the paperwork line up because the mechanics of closure are often where real power lies. Clean filings, clear dates, and signed pages that make rumor impotent. There was a cost to the ledger I kept. I went to therapy to stop being an instrument of reactive anger and to become someone who could hold consequence without cruelty. In sessions, I learned to name Mom without collapsing into grief, saying her name as memory rather than as accusation. I started running a route that used to bring me past the hotel loading dock but now turned away at the corner. That left me physically distant from a place that used to define my days. Sleep returned in honest stretches. I learned again what 8 hours felt like, and the quiet was almost alarming at first. There was a ritual I did once. I wrote a letter to my younger self, folded it, and burned it in a metal bowl. Watching the paper curl and then ash felt like releasing a contract I no longer needed. I declined interviews that would have turned the story into a spectacle. I said no to daytime TV and late-night pundits because I didn't want the work reduced to a soundbite. Satisfaction arrived not as applause but as a steady ledger. Staff retention up, vendor relationships reset, a clean brand transfer, scholarship applications opened. I added a small placard outside my office that reads in Mom's phrase, "We don't serve rooms, we serve people." I sit behind a desk with that line over my shoulder and know that the work now is to live up to it. The cost of silence had been discipline, the dividend is obligation. I am no longer trying to be visible to earn credit. I'm visible because the job requires it, and because there's a long list of small acts to do that make things better for the people who actually keep a hotel running. "We'll proceed in my order" wasn't a flourish. It was a policy, saying it was choosing procedure over passion, facts over fury. The cameras were there not to punish but to keep everything visible, transparency as a governance tool rather than spectacle. That choice shaped how the aftermath unfolded. Once something is documented and stamped and photocopied, it resists being smoothed away by charm or denial. I always intended the forum to be a clean moment. Documents presented publicly, consequences that followed predictably, staff protections enacted visibly. That's the work of stewardship, not revenge. Afterward, Daniel sent one-line updates, schedules, contractor contacts, a thumbs-up emoji when Maya's escrow hit. Sarah's memos read like surgical notes: chain of custody confirmed, trademark transferred, vendor assignments reconciled. I added a small placard outside my office with Mom's phrase, "We don't serve rooms. We serve people." It's not a slogan for press photos, it's a directive. Every morning I walk past that line and think about the tiny acts that fulfill it: paying a supplier on time, answering a staff call after hours, making sure training dollars are real and traceable. The forum closed one chapter, but it opened a long ledger of obligations. Control no longer felt like victory, it felt like a set of responsibilities I'd chosen under witnesses. I'd taken back what was taken in public, and because I did it transparently, the people who'd been erased could step forward without asking for permission. That is the work I answer to now. If this story hit a nerve, tell me where you're listening from. I read every comment. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more first-person family revenge stories. Watch the next video. You're not alone, and yes, you can win.